Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Philippa, and everybody for the invitation to speak today. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Charitable and Jagera people. This will necessarily be a somewhat of a superficial survey because, of course, the non-profit sector is large and diverse, from small land care groups through to national non-profit organisations. And so it's really just in an attempt to touch on some of the roles that not-for-profit organisations play and where they sit in the theme of this workshop around the role of public policy, of markets, and indeed perhaps non-profit or philanthropic activity. So just a little, just first of all, by way of introduction, the Pew Charitable Trust is an international research and public policy organisation. In Australia, we work on securing long-term and large-scale conservation outcomes in the marine environment and also in Outback Australia. The reason that we focus on the Outback is that, seen from a global perspective, there are few places left in the world that are still as environmentally intact as the Outback. That intactness is relative, of course, but when you think, when you turn your mind to the world at large, there are very few places that are in such relatively natural condition. For our work, we define the Outback broadly to capture those bioregions where you have largely intact native vegetation, and you end up with a scope of work that covers around 70% of the continent, albeit the least populated parts of the continent. The conservation values in the Outback, as in so many places in Australia and around the world, are threatened by a lack of active management. And it's a central tenet of our work that not only do people need nature for our survival and well-being, but also that nature needs people. That key threats like fire, feral weeds, and invasive weeds actually need active management. And this resonates, I think, with some of Philippa's comments about, well, what does it take to actually maintain or enhance the conservation values of a place over time? It's not just about drawing a line around it or regulating its use. It's also about that active work to manage it. So in that context, when we turn our mind to Outback landscapes, it's quite striking to think that in many, or at least some parts of the Outback, there are actually fewer people managing country than there have been for tens of thousands of years. And the reasons for that, the historical, social, economic, and biophysical reasons for that are complex. But essentially, we're looking at a situation where we have very large landscapes with really quite limited active management. And there are similar dynamics, although to a lesser degree, in our other agricultural landscapes. So what I wanted to do is touch on a few of the different ways in which non-profit organisations are engaged in perhaps what we could broadly call the conservation and land management sector. So firstly, as owners and managers of land, and perhaps in the non-profit conservation sector, you might think there of private conservancies, organisations like Bush Heritage and the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. But if we take a broader view of non-profit organisations, we could also consider native title bodies corporate and the Indigenous land management organisations that they've established that are taking an increasingly active role in managing around 20% of the continent. Secondly, of course, is the role of non-profit organisations in working with landholders and local communities. And again, we can think there of the land care network, organisations like the Natural Resource Management bodies, which in Queensland, of course, are non-profit organisations themselves, and any number of charities from local through to regional, state and national level. And also, of course, non-profit organisations of all kinds, from AgForce to the Queensland Conservation Council and many others, have an active role in informing and influencing policy. And also there are non-profit players who invest directly, so philanthropic investment in the conservation and land management sector. For Pew, we see our role principally as in that third category. So our principal role is to work with others in a collaborative way to inform and influence public policy. So we invest philanthropically in that work, but the way in which we work is we seek to be very much grounded in collaboration with those organisations and landholders that are actively managing landscapes for conservation and other values, including cultural and production values. So I guess just perhaps a few general observations or thoughts about the role of non-profit actors, broadly defined, as compared to the private sector or to government actors. Non-profit actors, non-profit organisations are able to pursue non-market outcomes. They're able to pursue outcomes that reflect the concerns and priorities of their internal and external constituencies. So non-profit organisations typically exist for a mission, and that mission could be a non-market or non-profit driven outcome. Some non-profit organisations are perhaps more nimble or flexible or adaptable than larger institutions, including some government institutions. And also non-profit organisations can, in some circumstances, have particular strengths in mobilising voluntary effort in the community and from landholders, can sometimes be very effective at building trust and mobilising philanthropic investment. And non-profit organisations, of course, can also play a role in delivering public programs that are funded by government. And when they do so, they may have some of the advantages I've already pointed to, as well as potentially the ability to do those things at lower cost or perhaps in some cases faster. But there are downsides. There are downsides of scale. There's often a tendency when talking about how we're going to meet the environmental deficit. There are often tendencies to overestimate the capacity of the philanthropic sector to invest in this work. It's often orders of magnitude smaller than the capacity of governments to invest in that area. There is also arguably a democratic deficit. Non-profit organisations are democratic internally to their own membership and constituencies, but they're not necessarily connected with the broader democracy of public policy making. And related to that is that the efforts of non-profit organisations can be disconnected from public policy decisions. And anybody who's been a member of a land care organisation working for years to restore a particular portion of habitat, only to see a local council approve a housing development or other development in an equivalent area of bushland just down the road, knows how that disconnect between community effort and government decision making can feel. So I just wanted to bring some of these ideas to life with a few case studies from our own work, not for self-promotional purposes, but just because it's familiar territory, and particularly to draw out some of the ways in which collaboration between stakeholders can help to build power and shift positive public policy outcomes. So the first of those case studies that I wanted to touch on is in the Indigenous land and sea management sector. So Pew has been working for around 15 years across Australia with Indigenous partners from local through regional to national level to seek to mobilise community, stakeholder and importantly government support for Indigenous land management. And the rationale for that is that through the effort of decades, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have gradually regained ownership, control, management of portions of their traditional estate. But the capacity to actively manage that land, to fulfil cultural responsibilities is limited. Sometimes we're talking about very large areas of land and just simply practical operational issues with reconnecting with and actively managing the land. So what does it look like in practice? I'll focus here on the advocacy component. We also provide funding support at the local level for things like the development of Indigenous protected area proposals and so on. But I'll focus here on the advocacy component. So what does it look like? First of all, there's a foundation of research and evidence, and in particular demonstrating the economic, social, environmental and cultural benefits of investment, long-term and increasing investment in Indigenous land management. Secondly, there's the communication aspect and communicating to key audiences from the very core of decision making, from the federal cabinet, the Prime Minister's office, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, out through Parliament, government agencies, stakeholders and the broader public. And we seek to amplify this story of the important work that's happening on the ground. And I think that's a theme that we seek to bring to life, not only in our Indigenous work, but more generally, is to say, what is this work that's being done on the ground? Who sees it? Who hears it? Who values it? And so the communication component is essential to this. And there are multiple means of communication, of course, including traditional media and digital media. On the screen here, this is Dean Outback, who's a leader in Indigenous land management in Arnhem Land in Northern Territory. He's standing in front of a billboard outside Darwin Airport that the Federal Indigenous Affairs Minister had to drive past every time he flew to Canberra. And so it's just about making this work much more visible, because so much of this work, not only of Indigenous land managers, but land managers generally, is out of sight and out of mind for people living in urban areas and people sitting at the centre of government policy and decision making. And then finally, what does it take to actually bring these constituencies, land managers of all kinds, directly into the political process? This is a leading elder from Western Australia and 2 Indigenous rangers in Parliament House, with a copy of The Australian with a full-page ad from the Country Needs People campaign, timed to coincide with their lobbying round in Canberra, and just an opportunity for them to speak firsthand about their practical experience, the cultural significance of this work, and to speak from the heart about what it means for them. So these are just a few small pieces of the overall puzzle. I'm proud to say that Country Needs People has now been, which was incubated within Pew, has now been established as an independent organisation with an Indigenous majority board and around 40 Indigenous Land Management Alliance members from around the country. Great thing is, it's working. And there have been many hundreds and thousands of people involved in this work over the past few decades. So I don't seek to claim this solely for Pew, but these collective efforts have helped to secure more than $1.8 billion in federal and state investment in Indigenous land management. That's now supporting more than 2,000 full-time, part-time and seasonal jobs in the Indigenous land management sector, and helping to support some really important conservation and cultural outcomes and land management outcomes across the lands which those ranger teams manage. One of those outcomes has been the establishment of Indigenous protected areas. And just earlier today, some of you may have seen that the Federal Minister for the Environment has announced a fresh round of new IPA development grants, which, once they come to their conclusion, will protect around a further 3.7 million hectares of land and sea managed by Indigenous traditional owners. I just wanted to be pleased to know that the second and third case studies are actually really short. Sweet. But I just wanted to give a bit of a feel for the way in which that collaborative advocacy approach can work. The second example is a piece of work that we ended up calling Working with Nature. And this was kicked off last year as the health and economic impacts of COVID were first becoming apparent. And it became clear that there were going to be quite acute economic impacts, including employment loss and impacts on rural and regional as well as urban communities. And that there was going to be, and as it turned out, actually tens of billions of dollars of federal government money and state government money flowing out the door to seek to cushion the shock of the economic shocks of COVID. So we helped to facilitate a collaborative piece of work by more than 100 conservation, farming and land management organisations, including some represented in the room here today, to make the case that that federal and state investment in practical conservation and land management work would provide a practical and publicly beneficial way of cushioning some of the shocks of COVID across the country, and particularly in regional areas. Now, the big federal play to get the federal government to go big on that didn't pan out, unfortunately, but we did have quite significant successes piecemeal at the state level. And in total, there was more than $1 billion worth of funding commitments made by federal and state governments that were in the conservation and land management sector broadly defined, where they explicitly pointed to the overlap between the positive environmental outcome and the employment and economic stimulus or economic recovery outcomes. Around 2/3 of those were in the infrastructure sector, things like national park infrastructure. So it wasn't entirely successful, but one of the key things that we're seeking to do is to reinforce this idea that public investment in practical conservation and land management can support employment outcomes as well as longer-term regional economic development outcomes. I've done my usual trick of trying to cram too much in, so I'll skip the third case study and just wrap up by just sharing some observations about the role of respective roles of public government investment, markets and philanthropy. And I'm conscious that these are topics that are being delved into by each of the speakers throughout the day. So this will necessarily just be some fairly superficial commentary. I think firstly, just in the role in terms of philanthropy, it can play a valuable role. I hope at least some of the work that we're doing with our philanthropic investment is valuable, but its scale should not be overestimated. In 2014, Martin Taylor from WWF did an analysis of protected area investment, federal and state governments and also private philanthropic. And the total federal and state investment in the management of protected areas, principally national parks, was 50 times larger than the total philanthropic investment in private protected areas. So we need to keep this in perspective. And when people sort of say, oh, look, we don't have to worry about it because the philanthropic sector is going to come to the rescue, we need to look at the numbers. There's certainly scope for improvement and growth, but the public investment is still currently, at least, the main game in terms of certainly protected area management, and I would argue conservation and land management more generally. In terms of market mechanisms, there's been a lot of commentary on market mechanisms today. I tend to come back to the fundamentals, not an ideological perspective, but just really practical questions. What are the rules of the market? All markets are regulated to some extent. What's the degree of regulation? Are they a product of regulation, or are they a product of preferences of individual consumers and firms in the market? So what are the rules? Who sets the rules? And to what extent do those rules help to deliver beneficial environmental as well as social outcomes? Who's buying? And that's often one of the key problems that we have for these stories about the market coming to the rescue, is we may have a beautiful product, but if nobody's buying, it really doesn't matter. And if government is the buyer, then that's fine, but is that the most effective way for them to deliver that investment? And what are they buying? And one of the things that I think is really important, and it's been touched on several times today, is market mechanisms will typically pursue a particular outcome. So the carbon market will deliver certain things. It's a product largely of regulation and government policy and taxpayer funds in Australia, but it is a market of sorts. And it delivers some things. It delivers some really important things, but there's plenty that it doesn't deliver, particularly on the biodiversity side of the equation. So with those considerations, our view and the view that motivates our investment in working with others to inform and influence public policy is that public investment is vital to deliver the range of public benefits that we seek to see, I would argue, not only in the environmental sphere, but also in regional development and social development more broadly, but also importantly to address those market failures. And when we're talking about the way in which public investment can and should be delivered, we argue also long-term public funding helps you to increase your impact over time. It increases the capacity of the organisations and community networks delivering the work, and it also helps to enhance resilience over time. And the Indigenous land management sector is really instructive in the way that long-term public investment has helped to provide the backbone for some of the other more exploratory pieces, the philanthropy, the innovation in carbon and fire management, for example. But the backbone has been long-term public investment, particularly, but not only by the federal government. And so for that reason, we see it as being really important to look at ways that we can work together across sectors and subsectors. How do we work together to tell the most compelling story about the long-term benefits of conservation and land management to the public at large, but particularly those who are making key decisions about investment and policy settings?